In this interview, I talked to Will McQuain, an ex-Silicon Valley guy and e-commerce expert that gave me a lot of the secrets to Silicon Valley and how all the big players are making millions on the internet. Make sure you listen or watch till the very end to get it all and learn from it. Welcome to Profession Session. I'm your host, Brody Vinson. And on this show, I talk to professionals in all different areas and talk about the successes they've had so that you can hear about how they did it. Today, I've got Will McQuain on, and we're going to talk a little bit about startups and the experiences that he's had in them. Will, thank you so much for being on.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I'm excited to get into this. It's been a little while since we've gotten to catch up, and you've been up to a lot of cool stuff. So I think we're going to get into some of those cool experiences you've had.
Sounds good.
Awesome. So I think the best place to start would be kind of the beginning of where I would say you got into startups in general.
Okay.
So you had one main one that kind of kicked things off for you. Could you tell me a little bit about just how you got involved in that and how that started?
Sure. So, I was a couple years out of college and I was working at a startup in San Francisco called Tilt. And so Tilt, main focus of what Tilt did was it was a social network built around money. So anytime that groups of people and money came together, Tilt wanted to exist at that intersection. And so we had a consumer app that was where like 95% of the workforce was focused on. And then we had a very small team focused on our enterprise product, which was meant to be an alternative to Kickstarter. So somebody who, had an idea and didn't want to look like three guys in a garage launching something. And, maybe people had a little bit of funding. We usually had a prototype or slick branding, and they would launch maybe like a landing page with a product under pre-orders instead of crowdfunding. So we built a product that made it easy for people to run pre-order campaigns and manage all of that, and issue refunds and take promo codes and set up referral programs and all of the things that you need when you're kind of like launching a product.
So kind of Kickstarter with a little bit less barrier to entry?
Kickstarter, a do-it-yourself Kickstarter. So
Cool.
Instead of existing on the Kickstarter platform where you pay maybe a higher fee in exchange for distribution to their audience, we would take way less of a cut and let you just install a button anywhere you wanted to launch it.
Okay, so sounds really good for like someone maybe with an existing audience or someone who really wanted to like focus on growing the audience themselves.
Yes, or somebody who felt so confident in their success that they were willing to spend upfront and not give too much of the fee to a platform like Indiegogo or Kickstarter. So that was
Very cool.
So that was the focus. And so in doing that, me and my team got to kind of be behind the scenes on a bunch of really interesting product launches. And so, helping the team and sort of knowing like, all right, on Wednesday morning at 9 a.m., they're going to launch, they're going to get press and TechCrunch and Verge and whatever. And we'll watch how this goes on day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4. And it was, for me, someone who had always kind of like nerded out on the idea of working at a startup or starting something that was like just this really exciting position to be able to watch over and over and over as these groups would come in and kind of like try to shoot out of a cannon. Some of them doing extremely well, some of them doing extremely poorly. And you got a sense of like how to launch a product. And so I was watching this for close to a year before I was like, okay, now I want to do this.
Hey, it's your host, Brody Vinson. Thanks so much again for tuning into Profession Session. And if you're enjoying this podcast, learning anything, please don't forget to subscribe or leave a review if you're listening on audio. Helps so much for growing the show and getting new and better content and better guests on. Thanks, and back to the show. Yeah.
And so
you're seeing just all kinds of different examples
yeah,
of it.
and some of them were, I'd look at them and be like, oh, these guys are way out of my league. They've got a lot of money, or they are all sort of like ex-Facebook or whatever pedigree on their resume made them seem like the type of people who could do it. And then others weren't that way at all. It was just sort of like some people who had a good idea and a good concept and a good landing page and messaging. And
it sounds like you saw some of those work as well.
Yeah. You saw a lot of the big ones not work.
Yeah.
Or most commonly, you saw a lot of people, we would appeal towards our demo was a lot of like, at the time, this was maybe 2013, 14, 15. It was a lot of smart, or I guess tech-enabled products, or like smart products, like a credit card that you could store multiple different cards on. Or
Oh, wow.
Like a drone that would follow you around and film you. So a lot of like things that would be at CES, that sort of stuff. And most commonly we saw people would do, $1 to $2 to $3 million in pre-orders in the first like month or two, just hugely successful, kind of like very like sizzle type products. And then we on the back end would sort of help them figure out how to continue to communicate with their audience and how to deal with refunds after it took them like a year to make the product, or a year and a half to make the product, or 2 years to realize, oh, we're not going to be able to make this product. Now we got to figure out how to refund everybody who we charged 2 years ago.
Yeah.
Can you help us with that? So all of that was kind of a nightmare. So learned a lot about what not to do from those groups.
So that was kind of on the enterprise side of it.
Yeah. So we would deal with a lot of pretty small teams, like some of whom had, a big long-term vision for what they were going to do, like Away Luggage started on.
Oh, I have one of their bags. It's amazing.
So do I. It's fantastic.
Yeah.
And so just, they probably at that time had a really great concept for what they were going to do, probably had funding, probably, we're just using, it's not like they needed us as consultants to help them out, but we were just positioned well to be like, hey, this is what tends to work really well when you're first announcing yourself and launching and taking pre-orders. And you can use some of this funding to either pay for some of the manufacturing that you're doing or use it to validate to other investors that you're good. What you don't want to do is spend all of that money to make the product or to try to make the product and fail. And then when people need refunds, then you've spent all their money and there's messes that happen there. But
so just giving them kind of a roadmap to like keep themselves on track financially for everything they had down the pipeline.
And specifically, it was all the e-commerce functionality that they needed to run that sort of a thing. So this was like in the early days of Shopify. Now it's super easy to set up an e-commerce store. It was a little more complicated at the time. And so we would work with people to say like, oh, you need a referral program where, to help you grow, maybe people who were already customers would say like, hey, use my promo code and I'll get $10 off and you'll get $10 off. Can you guys build that functionality? And we're like, okay, yeah, I feel like a lot of people would want that. Let's work on that because we have this launch. And that's the nuts and bolts of what I was doing as a product manager for that team. But then behind the scenes was like, okay, I want to do something.
Yeah, because this is exciting and cool.
Like it was kind of like the dawn of the direct consumer brand movement, where you've had things like Away Luggage coming out, or Warby Parker coming out, or Bonobos, or anybody who is just going to be like online storefront first.
Mm-hmm.
Casper Mattress is probably the biggest example. And I really like the look of a lot of those brands and these kind of like digitally native groups. And so
you saw a lot of brands just like spring up almost overnight and find so much success because I feel like people were able to put so much more work into or chose to put so much more work into the branding because it was brand first.
Yeah. So brand first. So you invest a lot in the brand, and you had just the ability to be a lot more nimble than like Sleep Zone or Mattress Firm, like that's your Serta. Like Serta's business is about like working with, the distribution of 2,000 mattress stores across the country. They're not really talking to the customer. They have research groups, and it's a big, they're figuring out, oh, we did XYZ thing. But Casper has the benefit of like really building a relationship with the customer. So when they're running ads, when they're setting up emails, they know like, oh, this type of messaging, this type of value proposition converts 7% better than this one did. So let's dial all of our marketing shift to that. It just is a savvier way to grow a business when you have all of the benefits of the internet. Whereas something like Tempur-Pedic, when it first started, was I don't know much about Tempur-Pedic, but I imagine it was before the kind of like internet 2.0 of communicating back and forth. And so it was a cool time to be there, and just right place, right time for me. And so I had always, going back to college, I was always interested in cigars. This was like a thing that I was into in college, and I really enjoyed how cigars kind of facilitate, kind of like a podcast actually, just like it forces you to sit down and for sometimes like an hour and a half, 2 hours, sit down and just
have a conversation.
And usually like a good conversation or like a real conversation. It's hard to have kind of like a surface level, shallow conversation. Something about a cigar, I think, kind of invites you to open up a little bit. And so for guys in particular, that's just not something that you do a lot unless you're, golfing or whatever. So that was something I was into all through college, and I've sort of got a lot of my friends into cigars. And for me, I was never like smoking every day. It was
It's like an occasional kind of
celebratory or sort of like, you know, seeing people you haven't seen in a long time.
kind of how I am with them too. It's a lot of fun.
I think it's how most guys are, but it's an intimidating thing to get into, right? I'm going to get into like messaging of stuff that we workshopped over, you know, the years of building the business. But
so I do want to definitely get into the cigar thing, but I do want to kind of cover some other parts that I don't want to skip past too. So kind of taking a step back real quick. Actually, like funny kind of tangent about Tilt. I've told you this before off air, but I remember being in college around like the time that Tilt was happening, and I was telling you like we used it, and I was in Greek life in college, and we used it. That you said that was a lot of the demo of like the non-enterprise side of it is just like social events in college.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure your experience of it was like, oh wow, everybody uses Tilt for this kind of thing, like you know, everybody put $3 in an envelope and we're gonna have a party on the weekend. Tilt was just a little bit slicker way to do that. Mobile first.
T-shirt orders, events, fraternity formals, like parties, like you said. It was very useful for all of that. It was essentially like there would be like a certain amount that you were supposed to pay in, and rather than having to like pool everyone's money to one person and then one person pay for it, like the system, it was like a savings, like a quick savings account for that.
And so on our end, that was like a very iterative process to land at the realization that like, oh, college students in particular, that's a very viral market for us. Like we would measure, we had stats on everything, like, you know, once you started a campaign, how likely are you to start another campaign within 60 days? And so we would evaluate a bunch of different demographics of how to do that, like buying a birthday party or throwing a birthday party or buying a birthday gift for your sister versus, you know, like HOA dues versus any number of different like use cases. And so when we measured that, we learned that the stickiness among college kids was like 3 times what any other demographic was. And so that
young people that are already tech savvy and have like things constantly going on.
It's people who are always doing things together, where usually nobody's rich enough to front the money for everybody else and get paid back later. And so Tilt was the natural like solution for that pain point. And so we very like sophisticatedly focused on building out a growth strategy that was focused on like, we want to be on every college campus everywhere. And so we had like a college ambassador program that I think at the time was the biggest, like the largest college ambassador program of any brand that existed, just because we were so focused on that. And we had,
and I don't remember for sure, but you said there was probably an ambassador at UCF where I went. I think that's probably the case, because I remember it was like overnight it was just like, all right, we're using this now. I was like early on. We had interns who were, a lot of them like social chairs of their own fraternity and sorority, who we would like send out, you know, to meet with. You know, we'd start with be like, oh, you were a Sigma Nu, you should go meet with Sigma Nus, and from there be like, who should I talk to? How do I get everybody on? And we would offer, like all startups do, you'd offer perks and incentives and ways to make it just really frictionless to do it. Or like, hey, if you guys can raise, you know, do a Tilt that has like $150 in it, we'll throw in an extra 20 on our end. And it worked extremely well. Now, we both know there's kind of like a point where it wasn't working quite as well, and I definitely want to get into that, because I think that's a very good thing to cover, kind of like the whole startup journey as we were talking about. I remember we were using it for, I want to say, a couple of years when I was in college, and then all of a sudden it wasn't around anymore, and we're like, what happened? We love Tilt. But you have kind of an inside perspective of what happened there. I wanted to cover that a little bit.
I mean, that was a really fun time to be in San Francisco, because there was a Tilt on every corner, right? Like whether it was like, oh, we're into cloud computing, or we're into crypto, or we're into food delivery, or like laundry delivery, a lot of on-demand services. This was like a few years after Uber came out, so there was like this just run of
it's like the gold rush of startups.
It was a cool time to be out there. And so
ironic that it was also in California.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, I mean, that's I feel like that's San Francisco's, the story of San Francisco is just like people coming there for some big rush, whether it's gold or startups. And so, yeah, I mean, I had gotten there, I was maybe employee number 20 or 25, something in that wheelhouse, until it had just raised its Series B round of financing. So they, you know, they went through Y Combinator to get a seed round, had an A round on the way out. And then as they were spending through that, raised something like $30 million for their Series B. And that was just like, it really had that kind of like heat around it, and it was sort of, you felt like one of the like, prettiest girls in the class in going to talk to VCs, and the CEO, my friend James, was just a really magnetic founder and salesperson. He's sort of like just the exact cookie cutter type of person that a VC is kind of looking for and trying to replicate, what's worked really well for them in the past, whether it's like a Dropbox or an Airbnb or a, what have you. So
as far as probably like creating company culture and being able to spread that out to the whole team.
VCs are, kind of just specialists in pattern recognition and trying to figure out like, all right, what are we going to take a risk on that we think is going to be huge and deliver 100x return on our money? And there's things that they start to figure out that may or may not be true for everybody, but like, generally founding teams of two, where there's like one sales founder and one engineering founder. If you're building a tech company, that's a pretty good way to do it. Some VC firms like won't even invest if there's a single founder, because maybe just their track record shows that having two people is better. And having
just statistically works out more.
And having run like a startup solo, I get why. Like, it's really draining to feel like you're in the trenches by yourself and you don't have.
And it's hard to have both of those skills. They're very like, I don't want to say competing skills, but you don't often find those very strong
in the same person.
Both very strong in one person.
Totally agree. And so that was Tilt, and Tilt had a really massive, big vision. This is something I didn't really realize this at the time, but now being a few years out and having fundraised a few times, the mindset of somebody who does venture capital, or even earlier than that, kind of like seed investing or angel investing. They're if they're smart and they have a process about it, they're making at least 10 bets, and their thinking is that like, hey, I'm assuming 9 of these are probably going to fail, but I need one of the 10 of these to return 100x my money, and I'll make back what I invested.
Make back 90x basically, yeah.
And so Tilt's vision, if you think about like, the early stage of like, we're just getting college kids to spread money around, Tilt's massive like 30-year vision was to replace the IRS. Like, right? Like
what?
Taxes are a way for groups of people to pool resources to build things that sort of benefit the whole, right?
Wow.
And so if you could build a layer that everybody was on, and they had this kind of like just long-term vision of the just, I guess, 3 years of mobile adoption plus crypto plus, one other, I forget what the other thing was, but just, to be this platform to empower collective creation. There were some really cool examples of like a neighborhood outside of SF, maybe like an hour into the Bay Area, that was like had a big problem with crime, and so everybody was dealing with this in their own way, and everybody hated it. And so somebody in that neighborhood who was just a really motivated homeowner got sort of made the case for everybody. They used Tilt, and they used Tilt to pay for security in the neighborhood. This sort of like, hey, this is going to be too expensive for everybody, but there's a massive benefit to all of us if we had, security patrolling around. And like over the year that they had it compared to the year before, I think crime had dropped like 85% in that neighborhood. It was like extremely successful. And so those were the kinds of use cases that we were trying to push, because we're like, this is the vision, this is what we wanted to do. And imagine, let's all pitch in and, fix a pothole, or, even things like in Jacksonville, like coming here after living in Atlanta and SF, I'm like, man, there should be like a cool speakeasy bar here. And there's probably enough people who feel that way that they're like, man, wouldn't it be great? And that like the, big vision of Tilt is like, hey, somebody should just sort of put that out there and be like, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we had one? I'm going to start a Tilt. I'm going to put $100 in, and you can say like, put it in as little or as much as you want. And if there's enough appetite for it, that like should happen, right?
And I'm trying to think back to, correct me if I'm wrong here, but from what I remember using it, didn't it charge you if it actually tilted? So like it didn't actually charge you until it tilted?
Yeah.
It was like you're making a pledge until it actually
so the idea is you're like, hey, we want to open a bar, and it costs $20,000 to like, that's, I think, not nearly enough. But let's say it's $20K, and then you get it up, and everybody chips in, and you reach 19, and then the timer runs out, you're in your 30-day campaign, or however long you wanted it to be. Then everybody would get their money back and nobody would be charged. That's like the vision for it. On our end, it's hard to be like, okay, we're going to actually like swipe their credit card and tokenize the card. We need the funds to be kind of in escrow on our end, but not. So the like tech functionality underneath was
A lot of logistical difficulties.
Very logistical difficulties, especially if like there were some of them that would say like, let's simplify it and say we want to throw a party and it costs $1,000 to rent the space, and I want, like, as long as 20 people show up, I still want to have the party, but as much as 100 people could show up. And so you could say like there's a ways to do it where you split the cost. So let's say we're all swiping in, and if there's only going to be 10 people at the party, everybody has to pay, I forget the number I said, like $100.
Yeah.
Right? So then, but if 100 people show up, everybody only pays $10. So this is getting really into the nitty gritty of the tech stack. But you know, when the 20th person swipes their card, you've authorized all the cards, and then you want to charge everybody, but are you charging them for $20, or are you charging, because you don't know where it's going to end up?
Exactly.
And so
that is tough. Wow.
People, and if you pay with a debit card instead of a credit card, it doesn't actually just authorize the card. It actually
charges.
It actually charged you, so people will be confused about that. And that's how I started there in customer support.
Oh, that sounds fun.
And dealing with that, you know, people not knowing how their debit card works versus their credit card, or saying like, hey, I want a refund. And there's a lot of that. But it was a great place to start. I think that's a really great place to start in. Is this going to work? A really great place to start in company if you're young and you don't have, you know, if you're not a coder, you're looking to join a tech company. I think there's a lot of places you could end up, and customer support is a really great place to start, just because you end up becoming an expert on the product and how the product.
You have to become a problem solver about the product.
You become a problem solver. You understand who the audience is, not who the desired audience is that they hope is using the app, but like if I'm in customer support, I'm figuring out like, hey, 9 out of 10 of these tickets are college kids. So even if you think it's a bunch of wealthy people who are using Tilt to fund their HOA,
these are the people that are actually using it way more consistently.
And it's, so that was, I started there, and then by the time I left Tilt, I was a product manager, and I think the time of working and dealing with people's frustrations with the app is a really great thing to have when you're designing it, to make sure like, how can you design a product that doesn't require a lot of customer support, right? We want to grow. We want to, in the next year, 10x our growth and not hire 10x the customer support agents.
Exactly.
Ideally.
Yeah, I think that's why you see so many big brands that have such big online presences have these very, very built out customer support pages where it's like landing pages that go to like multiple different things.
You want to do as much self-serve as you can so that you can find your answer. Because you also don't, if you have a problem, you would prefer to figure it out quickly as opposed to talk to me. Even if I'm great, even if I like write a, you know, very human response that you get in 30 minutes, it's still better to that you're kind of thoughtfully guided towards, oh, I have a debit card, not a credit card. This will get refunded in a few days.
I just had an idea. I don't know if I want to stay on this particular topic for too long, but just while it's on my mind, have you done much research into AI stuff lately?
Yeah.
I've been really into Chat GPT. I just realized I'm always trying to think of like different use cases for it. They could be a really good tool to like help you with customer support. It's still so difficult. I end up like trying to get on the phone with someone so much of the time anyway, because it's so difficult to navigate through all those different pages. But if you just told Chat GPT, hey, figure out this problem for me, it could do a much better job.
Or even, let like, I'm going to just copy and paste everything in our help desk into your brain. And if, you know, you have to probably, the hard part about doing that is that it's got to kind of like keep up to date with where the product is. So like whatever you upload now might be different than how the product behaves in 3 months. But absolutely, yes. Like almost 80% of all of the issues are things that somebody could have figured out if they would have just read the FAQ. And so to type it to Chat GPT, I think it could pretty effortlessly give a reasonably good answer.
It's very good at distilling things down.
Yeah. And then you've got for the remaining 20% who really do need help, who really do have like, you know, a complicated problem, which would happen a lot.
Or an unprecedented problem.
Then having a human who can step in is better. But yeah, I mean, it's just gonna eat so many jobs.
It's crazy.
Eat so many jobs.
It's crazy. I'm trying to just stay on the front curve of it, so I feel like I'm like keeping up with it, but it's very difficult.
I think that now I remember like getting into TikTok in the early part of like when the pandemic first started, and really not realizing how, I know that I'm, you know, relative to like 15-year-olds, that's like they're 2 years late, but relative to a lot of people my age, I was very early. And I wish I would have just started making things at the time. There was just so many people who, at that point, you don't realize how early you are, and I feel exactly the same way. I'm like, I gotta just
Gotta take
dive
advantage
into
of it.
this while we're in the first inning of it.
Yeah, I've been having it do all kinds of stuff. Like you can have it write business plans. You can have it write. I mean, you could have it write an essay for you. Hopefully, none of my professors are listening to me say that.
I know. I've had to do that too. I've had to do that too. It's already written blog posts for me and the stuff that I'm working on now.
Yeah, I feel bad for copywriters. I mean,
I think
there's probably a way to figure out how to get in and adapt a little bit, but I feel bad for copywriters because it's got to really knock out their job fast.
I know, and it's not going to take but it like absolutely would just. It's already like I would say 80% of copywriting gigs. That's how I am. It's like I don't need a lot of what I'm writing for the most part, as long as it's not like, brand copy and sort of like the really important defining attributes of what you're trying to do. Like if it's a blog post or if it's an email, or if it's whatever, I don't need it to be perfect. I don't need it to be poetry.
If it can do 80-90% as good as you were going to do in 0.5% of the time.
Yeah. Well, the hard part for me is like the blank page. Like I'll just be sitting there and I'll be like, and I'm kind of like trying to write and edit at the same time, which is not, a great way to do it. But for me to just say like, hey, spit out the
Give me
first
something to
version of
start
this,
with,
and then let me take it from 2 to 10.
It's funny you say that. I was just talking about it with someone last night. I used the example. I don't know if you're a SpongeBob guy. I used the example of the episode where he was trying to write an essay and he spent like the entire night to write the word "the," and like if he had Chat GPT, SpongeBob could have written that essay. Like he could have at least started.
That's how I feel when I'm writing sometimes.
Yeah.
I'm just like cannot get out of my own.
How do you
head
get started?
I'm reading it while I'm trying to write it. I'm just like, oh, that was terrible. Delete. Delete.
Gives you a great place to start though.
So I mean that sort of stuff, and that would have been, probably in the wheelhouse of if I were to start that job tomorrow, like, half the job is actually helping people, trying to respond to tickets, and the other half of the job is how can you prevent support from
Exactly.
and sometimes you're so buried in tickets that you can't actually do the stuff to improve, and that's like it's a metaphor for building any kind of business. Is sometimes you're so busy working in the business that you can't work on the business.
Very true.
I saw something on TikTok where you can get it to output things in table format, like I was asking, we were sort of like trying to get it to guess like what college was going to cost by the time my daughter's in college.
Wow.
And it can't do it. So some of that stuff would be like, I can't make predictive stuff, and she's like,
it won't give you personal information.
I'm like, give me the average cost of college over the last 10 years formatted as a table.
Wow.
And it will give me like 1990, 1995, 2000, 2005, 2010, and just give me like 2-year 2-year private, 2-year public, 4-year private, and we'll just spit out all the averages for you.
Wow. And you could probably have it like try to account for inflation in some way, like give you like a adjusted rate for that.
Yeah, and you're like, based on this, extrapolate the next 20 years. That's the cool part, is you can just say like, based on that, figure this out, and the
memory
figure that out. And like how to interpret the words based on that. Like it's a very human way to talk, and it's conversational. It's very conversational. That like I think that we're probably not even appreciating some of the more mind-blowing, impressive things that it's doing like that.
Yeah, I try to like just look up different potential ways to use it all the time, because it's like I mean, we're probably scratching like 1% of the surface right now. It's exciting. It's
just starting. Yeah. There's a quote, and people would say this a lot, or maybe it was just the CEO, but I felt like living in San Francisco, and maybe it was the time of being there. It really did feel like living in the future. And there's a phrase, but maybe it's a sci-fi author. I'm going to butcher if I try to guess who it was, but the quote is, the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. I think that's so true of Chat GPT, right? Like I would say that probably 90% of people don't even know it's out yet.
Yeah.
It's already.
That's it. Yeah.
It's coming for us.
That's cool. Yeah. It's a very exciting thing. Just trying to like observe and stay with whatever that future is. I really like that quote.
Yeah. It's a cool quote.
So going back to Tilt for a second, kind of want to like, as a way of kind of segueing to the next chapter of your career, could you talk a little bit about what ended up eventually happening with Tilt and what that meant for like a change in your career and like going from there? Because we kind of like hopped straight into Good Cigar Company, but there's like a whole story behind what led you there.
I'll get real shiny object with all these conversation threads. So I'll try to bring it all back together. So like I said, there was a tilt on every corner. So it was a time where it was very easy to fundraise. Venture capital firms had a lot of money. They were all kind of like just a great time to be in that sector.
Do you think it's gotten harder to fundraise?
Since then, there have been waves. I think we're right now in a very difficult fundraising environment for most things.
Partially the economy, I'm sure.
Partially the economy, partially like just, performance of tech stocks right now in public markets, partially the crypto crash. There's just
couple bubbles.
There's a lot of headwinds against it right now, but there's also a lot of capital out there, and a recession is a really great time to start something.
Agreed.
So if you can do it, do it. But so Tilt's experience, like I said, we were focused on college kids. So the thing about focusing on college kids is that we were really hitting the growth numbers insanely. Like our objective, we were trying to grow 20% month over month, and we were hitting that for a very long time in terms of
that's very impressive.
User numbers or revenue coming through the app, but to get a lot of those students, we're incentivizing adoption, we're waiving fees, we're not, the business model made sense, but it had to be enormous in order to justify its, in order to sort of be the kind of business that we wanted it to be, right? Like the kind of big vision of the IRS, we would refer to it as like a social network around money. And we're like just the classic, all of us think we're going to be just like multimillionaires winning IPOs. We're tilting just like a giant boat in the bay for Halloween parties. We're tilting a private jet to Vegas for one night to like see a DJ and
talk about feeling just unbeatable.
Oh, we were feeling like we're on top of the world. We truly would describe it to people. I'm like, it's like Facebook and Amazon had a baby. Is what we really thought that we were building. And there's a alternate timeline where Tilt achieved that mission. It's not like it was a total swing and miss.
Sounds like you've got something to take up with the creator of the multiverse.
Exactly.
Just said, put me on the other timeline.
Exactly. Just throw me into that other timeline. I'd love to see what that looked like. And so we were, our CEO is just like leading. He was a fantastic, very charismatic leader, and just was like, all right, we're about to close this next round. Da, da, da. And at the time, you have a little bit of sense of the funding of the business, but not a perfect sense into it. And so it's easier as a leader to give total clarity into something when everything's going great. It's harder to know exactly how much to reveal when things are really tight and you don't find out. People are like, oh, last year we were one client away from missing payroll. And it's like, as a leader, you don't want to say, hey guys, we might miss payroll.
It's not easy to be inspirational when you say that.
Exactly. And so kind of out of nowhere, we get called in one day and they're like, hey guys, we, we're hoping to get a deal on this latest fundraise round that fell through. And so we were out of options. And so we've been acquired by Airbnb, just like mic drop. And we were
wow.
Like, what?
That's crazy.
Which, first of all, it's like, why Airbnb? Doesn't totally make sense to us. And the narrative was Airbnb is building out, they want to make it so that if you're traveling in a group of people, you're renting a house that everybody could chip in. And we're like, okay, that kind of makes sense. Fast forward, I don't think they ended up building any of that at all. It was just a situation where we needed out immediately. It was either, I think the CEO really had the decision on his plate of you can either make a deep cut and you can fire 70 people and try to start this over with a team of 10, or get out now and sell. And he'd been pouring his life into it for 5 years, and it was an understandable thing that for him, all of us who had equity in it and hoped to be, like I said, multimillionaires, all of those dreams were dashed. And I think he was able to have a decent exit or have his stuff converted into Airbnb stock and did really well on it. And it's, it had this amazing experience that sort of enabled him to go and do, the other things that he was going to do or lead a team at Airbnb for a little while. And so I had the dilemma of saying okay, either apply for a job at Airbnb or should I go full time on this thing that I've been moonlighting on. So while I was at Tilt.
And real quick, interjection here, sorry to interrupt. I would guess that if they were going to keep some of the team of Tilt, I would guess probably not the enterprise team, right? Because that's like a whole different business model than why they acquired it.
So what Airbnb needs is good engineers, right? There's like a joke in Silicon Valley that like when you're evaluating a startup, it's like take every good engineer that they have, and for every good engineer you add $1 million to the valuation, and for every MBA you have subtract $150,000.
Really? Okay.
That's the joke. And it's true when you're building a tech company, like engineers are just that much more valuable because they're the ones truly, building your app. And they're good engineers are a lot more difficult to replace than, somebody like me who was in customer support or product manager or any number of different roles. And so Airbnb needed engineers, and no one was guaranteed a spot. It was basically like Airbnb was buying us, and everyone has to interview for a spot there. So I think they maybe only took like 15 or 20 of the 80.
Wow.
Maybe a little bit more than that, but that sounds about right. And so, we're all kind of trying to keep the lights on, and there's like a little bit of funding to kind of sunset the thing and to set up the page for students at UCF to be like, hey, where's Tilt? What happens when I go to Tilt? And the message that's like, hey, we've, agreed
it's been great.
Thanks for the memories. And so, for the months leading up to this, I had been using Tilt actually to validate this concept that I had, which was like a direct consumer cigar brand. So getting it, around to this experience that like guys like us like it occasionally, but you probably don't have a humidor. You probably aren't sitting a bunch of cigars. It's a tough thing to get into because
it's an expensive hobby.
It's an expensive hobby, and you kind of need to be a full on nerd about it. There's no equivalent to like picking up a 6-pack of cigars. You kind of have to have like a kegerator at your house. Like that's the level of commitment into the hobby that you need to like do it regularly enough. And so you need a cigar, you need something to cut it with, you need something to light it with, and you need some place to store it that's in optimal humidity, which is like
takes space, takes money
to buy. So that means most people end up when they're doing it, they're like, oh, and it's intimidating. You sort of feel like you've got to do it right. You don't want to cough. You don't want to look dumb. So these were all of the kind of things that I wanted to address with what I was doing, which was called Good Cigar Company. And the idea was that, hey, if you're not a huge cigar guy, if you're not a huge cigar smoker, I don't want to say guy because there's a lot of women getting into cigars as well, especially in Atlanta, where we ended up moving. But, the product was, we're going to give you, you're going to buy a pack from us, and the only decision that you have to set is like the intensity level. We're going to offer like mild, medium, or full bodied. And then within that, the cigar that we're going to put in this pack for you is going to be reliably good, curated by us. You don't have to worry about smoking something that's not good or knowing what brand is like attractive and what's not.
Yeah, because I've stepped into like the rooms in like a cigar bar or something to pick one out. You get this like paralysis of analysis if you're not like a total nerd on it.
You don't know which one of those things is going to like knock you out. Like
you're like, oh, this one looks cool, I guess.
It's like that scene in The Sandlot where all the kids do chewing tobacco and they're all like growing up. Like if you pick the wrong thing, it really could knock you out if you, especially if you're like inhaling, you don't know not to inhale. There's just a lot of things to know. And most cigar shop owners are like, at least in my experience as being like in my early 20s and going to shops, like they weren't even nice to me. They weren't like, if I was them, I'd be like, oh, how cool that you're in my store. You don't look anything like the usual like 55-year-old retired vets who come in here every day to play cards.
But they are very intimidating. That's funny you say that.
They don't do a good job of welcoming people in, and so that's what I really wanted to do with the brand and with our products. And so our product was 2 cigars there's 2 cigars, a cutter, matches, and then a tasting note card that would describe like, hey, this is the the Oliva Series G Cameroon wrapper, and it's a Robusto size, so it's a 5 ring gauge and a 50 length, and we're going to give you sort of like tasting notes. You're going to pick up from this like a little bit of
it's like having a sommelier for your cigar.
Exactly, like the little card that you see when you're shopping at the wine store, and it's like, oh, this got a 91 in Wine Spectator, and you're going to pick up like it's going to be fruity and bold and a lot.
Have you heard of Cooper's Hawk? Familiar with that? It's this restaurant that does these. It's like a monthly subscription for like a wine tasting. Yeah. You get a wine tasting for 2 and then 2 bottles a month. Okay. And they have like during the tasting, you get this whole card where it like outlines all the different flavors of the wines and like they walk you through it.
So that's exactly what Good Cigar did. Yeah. So all of that was in a attractive little bag that was sealed, and in the cigar we would put this humidity packet that would keep it at optimal humidity. So for like a year, inside the packet would be exactly 72% humidity. So when you open, so it allowed us to create for people this kind of like 6-pack ease of, hey, somebody's coming in town, let's light up a cigar, let me just like rip this open, and like I've got one, you've got one, we can cut it, we can light it. There's instructions on the back of the pack on how to smoke a cigar if you don't know what you're doing. And then this little card that will help us sort of like, for the 5 minutes that you want to speak intelligently about this, you're like, oh, are you getting like, you know, hay and pepper here? Like, no, me neither. You know, who cares? And so that was the concept. So I'd use Tilt to validate it, right? So this was, you know, using all of the functionality that we had built in for college kids to be like, hey, do we want to sell a shirt for our party? No. So I use that to be like, hey, let's get some of these made. Let's do like kind of a low fidelity version of it. I worked with a designer who worked at Tilt, and just like in the off hours was like, hey, can I pay you $500 to help me design this? And my friend Carly, who worked there, was like, hey, you're a great photographer, can you help me shoot this? And so I just put it up as a Tilt campaign with the picture of the product, and we launched it, I think, December 1st, or maybe, no, it was around Thanksgiving, saying like, hey, do you know what you're getting your dad for Christmas, or your brother or your uncle? Like that kind of, you know, that's a hard person to buy for. This is a perfect stocking stuffer. It's $25. And
that's a good price, actually, really, because you're typically paying for like a good cigar. You're typically paying like $15 for a decent one. So you're actually saving there and getting the convenience.
Yep. And the long-term vision there was like, you know, it's difficult and in some cases illegal to market tobacco products. So the long-term thinking there was like, you know, if we become a reliable brand or destination where people who are getting into cigars would trust us to curate cigars for them, then we should be able to get like really attractive price points from the suppliers to sort of put their cigars in a really fantastic light for somebody to enjoy them the way that they're meant to be enjoyed. And, you know, when we were scheming it out, the concept of it, I was even thinking we would get them for free, that we would be like an advertising vehicle for cigar brands. That was sort of the vision of the company. And to some extent, you know, like we got people to buy into that. But getting back to the, you know, that chapter of Tilt. So I had the goal, I think we wanted to sell maybe 100 of them. That was like what I was like, this is the threshold where if I can sell more than 100 of these,
like 100 of the 2-packs.
Yeah. Then, you know, we have something, there's something here. And we sold 200 of them. And that was buoyed by the fact that everyone who was buying them were my friends who worked at Tilt. They were users of the app. They were trying to get other people to use the app. So they're buying it, just helping me out. And then they're sending it to their brother or their dad or their mom. Saying like,
still a great way to start a user base, though.
Yeah, so so that was fantastic. And so I was like, okay, this is great. It's going to take me maybe like 6 more months of moonlighting. I'm going to keep my day job. I'm not like going to jump into this ship right away because there's so much more to do. And so we like got everything out. It was kind of crazy to assemble everything in the floor of my living room in San Francisco. And like walk, you know, boxes to the post office to ship them all out. And we just truly on the last day that we could get them out, making sure they're under the tree, is when we got them to the post office. And then, you know, I'm like all Christmas break, just sort of dreaming about the next year and getting that off the ground. And then our first day back, they were like, hey, we're going under. We sold to Airbnb. Everybody's got an interview. So that was the moment where I was like, okay, I can either go and interview for a job. And I ended up getting an offer at Airbnb. And so I had this offer of, do I want to go and work there or go full-time on.
And what kind of position was that offer for?
It was, and Airbnb was a much, much bigger company than Tilt was at the time. So they had this concept called super cities where they really wanted to lean into
maybe more of the experiences.
Yeah, so building up the experience side of their business.
I did a speakeasy tour one time when I visited Austin. Yeah. That's the only time I've ever done one of those experiences. It was awesome.
Yeah, it's like a cool thing. It's been a slow adoption rate, I think, for the company, but really, really like great idea and way for them to expand. Especially if you're a host, you're sort of like, hey, someone's coming and staying at my place in Austin. I also can lead a speakeasy tour and then take my nightly rate from $200 a night to maybe like $300 a night.
Yeah.
Makes sense in so many different ways. But at the time, I think like SF was one and Barcelona was one. And so I was going to be like a operations lead of the Super Cities program. I didn't even really understand much of what it was, but
Probably earlier in the concept at that point.
yes, yeah, exactly. And so I knew Airbnb was an amazing place to work, but my wife had at that point worked at Airbnb for 7 years. So I was getting a little bit of
That's a long time. I knew that she worked there at the time. I didn't know it had
I
been
may have
that
my
long.
years wrong, but she had been there for long enough, such that I even got like a little tip off before we were told that we were selling that Airbnb. So like the news had broken on at least on her team.
Oh man, that must have been a tough thing to keep quiet.
It was a very incestuous like situation.
Yeah.
So, like, hey, like my wife's telling me stuff that's happening at her company because her company's about to buy my company.
Yeah.
It was a wild time, but I was like, you know what? As a family, if Airbnb takes off, like we already have a kind of like toe in this pool.
Yeah.
And for me, the dream was always to start something.
Mm-hmm.
So that was like, this is the moment to do it. We don't have kids. We're young. My wife has a great job. We've been saving a lot. So let's go. And so that's
what a perfect time to do it. Yeah.
That's what I did. So it was maybe the winter of 2016, 2017. And we were off to the races. So I was like, to quit my job, and I was able to get paid by Tilt to almost like sunset things. So everybody was gone. There was a little bit of money just to keep the lights on and wind things down. And so I was able to like, cash some checks doing that, like the odd jobs of the handful of people who still needed to like get their money out of the platform.
Just realized now that you gave me the actual timeline, because I couldn't remember exactly when Tilt got sunsetted, but just realized I've kind of got beef with the whole process now because I was the treasurer of my fraternity the year after. So I had to do
then you had
everything
by hand. You had to do the old school.
A lot of Venmo requests, a lot of follow-up texts.
Yeah.
A lot of people hating you. But
Well,
yeah,
we would have loved to have stuck around.
Yeah.
We would have loved it to have gone differently. That's funny.
But I mean, it brought you to Good Cigar Company, and then
Yeah.
I mean that's been going really well. So what has happened since the last time we talked with Good Cigar Company? Because I know you've got some updates on that.
So, all in all, I ran Good Cigar Company for about maybe 2.5 years before it was acquired. So we had a very similar competitor, and we just sort of felt like we were like both kind of just like, really competing for the same eyeballs of the same audience of the, kind of like the guy like you who will smoke occasionally, but not often enough to like, buy a box. A box is 20 cigars, which is insane. Like even as somebody who likes cigars, it's a wild starting point. It's like
it's a hard thing to justify, like, because the 1 year mark of like how long it's going to stay fresh for is a pretty good amount of time, especially if you're just getting one pack. Like you're going to use that, but 20, if you're occasional, you're probably not going to go through 20.
Yeah. And if you've got 20, then you're going to need a humidor, and a humidor you can keep them in there. If you keep it humid, the cigar will last years. It really won't go bad if you keep it in optimal condition. But it's really like somebody who drinks beer being like buying a keg. It's just like it's a certain kind of person.
You're deciding, like, I'm going to be that guy.
I'm drinking every day, and this is why I need a keg. So there just was not something that was like a bottle of wine for cigars, unless you're going one at a time to the store and you're storing it in a little Ziploc bag. And if you don't smoke that in 6-7 days, it's probably drying out, and you don't realize it. So 2.5 years in total. I guess life stuff happening in between there was my wife and I left San Francisco to move to Atlanta. So California, which is where we started the business, it's a great place. San Francisco in particular, great place to start a company. Maybe one of the best places to start a company, but one of the worst places to start a tobacco company. Which
because of the regulation.
Because of the regulation and honestly the like attitude towards cigars and tobacco, understandably. But mostly the taxes. So California voted to raise its tobacco tax from something like 15% to 60%. All of this is designed to make it harder for people to buy cigarettes, but they don't carve out within the laws like exemptions for premium cigars, which is not the point. They're not worried about 17
the like
kids
side effects of it,
or even like they're not worried about underage smokers of $15 cigars. Like I don't think they're having a big problem with like kids going in and buying those, and that's really not, as long as you're smoking less than 1 or 2 cigars a day. There's really, I'm not going to say that they're good for you. They're absolutely not good for you, but there's almost no linkage.
It's not going to put you in like habitual cigarette smoker territory.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But there's just, it's tobacco which is obviously harmful. So there's a lot of headwinds to that. And so when they raised the taxes, it just became immediately unprofitable for us to be based in. We just didn't have the margins to
That's
support.
a massive hike.
Massive hike. So we moved to Atlanta, really just for no reason at all other than like if this doesn't work, or if my wife isn't able to work remote for Airbnb, we need a big enough city that we can get jobs in again.
Yeah.
So we just picked Atlanta, kind of like
A lot of good startup type of stuff going on in Atlanta too.
yeah, especially now. Not so much when we were there. We moved there maybe like 4 years ago.
Okay, yeah. It's really kind of recently, last couple of years,
Yeah,
become that way.
it really is. It was a cool place to live for the time that we were there. And we moved to Atlanta, which ended up being a great place to be for that business because there's a big cigar scene in Atlanta, and it was just a lot more favorable towards what we were doing. And I feel like in San Francisco, we were a drop in the ocean of like, hey, I have a startup, and they're like, oh, you too, you and everybody else in this coffee shop,
you and every neighbor I have,
literally everybody I'm looking at. And in Atlanta, it was a little bit more unique, and people thought it was cool, and it was just a great place to be and to grow that business. And there was a lot of things that we did really well, and for me, it was just getting to wear every hat, and you have this, you're working somewhere, and you're in the back of your head, you're like, oh man, if I was in charge, would we be doing this or this or this or this? And you can fantasize about that. And so it was great to be.
It's very humbling actually doing it.
Very humbling to realize that like you got to do it all, and if you don't do it, then and it's not getting done. And a lot of things you thought you were good at, you're actually not very good at, and stuff you thought you might like, you actually don't really like. So learn.
Start to say, oh, I thought I had a work ethic.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Yeah. Turns out you just have like constant imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
You're like, oh man, how does anybody do this? Or I'm like, I'm terrible at this. So definitely tons of ups and downs in that business, but ultimately, the tricky part about that business was mostly customer acquisition. So like when you're running specifically like a direct consumer brand, right? The kind of lifeblood of that, the metrics that you track are what is your customer acquisition cost, and what's your LTV, what's the long-term value of your customer. And like if you those two things, as long as
those are
economics work out, you can probably rinse and repeat. But paid acquisition, and specifically paid acquisition on platforms like Facebook and Instagram, is kind of the lifeblood of consumer brands at that time. Like if you're Casper or Warby Parker, you're just like spending a ton on Facebook for ads and measuring the clicks and saying like, okay, it costs us about $25 to get a customer, or and at that time it was a great time to be doing it. It was sort of like just a sweet spot in digital marketing. But for us, we couldn't do that. So like it wasn't even that the laws were restrictive about advertising. It's like we can't try to get somebody who's not 18 or in some cities 21 to buy cigars. But for us, that like the terms of service on Facebook ad policies and Instagram ads or Google ads were like, no gambling, no porn, no tobacco. We would just get lumped into all of those kind of like R or X rated activities that they just don't want on the site. So we could not.
It just dramatically limited what you were able to do.
Yeah. So for us, we had to figure out other ways of getting in front of customers that were a lot less scalable. So like usually what you're doing there is you're like, all right, we're going to spend $50 a day, $100 a day on Facebook Marketplace and figure out an ad where, okay, we're reliably getting customers for X. Once that works, then just apply budget. Like that's a moment where you say like, okay, then let's now go and get capital and let's pour money into this business. And for us, we had to kind of take like bigger swings. We'd be like, okay, we're going to spend $3,000 for like placement on this men's interest site and hope that it converts. And if it does convert, that's great. Let's do it as often as we can do that. And
what a challenge.
It was super challenging. It was the hardest part of running that business. And ultimately, we just never quite got to a place where we could reliably spend $1 and get $2. And you kind of need to figure that out.
Mm-hmm.
Like people liked the product when we got it in front of people. It did what we wanted, and we added on a subscription element to it, which was much easier because then you're spending acquisition costs once, and then if you lock them into
lifetime value is way better,
way higher. And so we built that out, but ultimately, so I was kind of like staring down the barrel of my daughter being born. So this was maybe like a few months before we had our first kid, and was just, you know, my business partner, they had a baby. He was like getting more and more busy with his job. And I think he just one day was like, hey, I've got to like, for a few months, I'm going to be way less available. And I just sort of suddenly felt alone and felt like we were just pushing a boulder up a hill, and the hill wasn't getting any less steep and the boulder wasn't getting any less heavy. And I had met the founder of our kind of like rival company, and just went and met up with him and kind of entertained the idea of joining up, and ended up like really seeing the merits of that. And they were in a position to be able to afford to buy us. We could not have afforded to buy them. And
I think you had mentioned off air, they had just figured out a couple pieces of it that you hadn't quite figured out yet.
So for them, I think they had figured out
maybe that acquisition
really the channel. So for them it was YouTube. So they were paying a bunch of like YouTube channel. There were, you know, guys who would sit in their backyard and review.
It's like Gary V's wine library.
Yeah,
very for cigars.
So and I'd seen a lot of those guys, and just in my mind I was like, oh, these channels, like they're going after kind of guys who smoke all the time. That's not really in our wheelhouse, and we just never really explored that. And they had done it, and it was working really well for them. And that was an area where they were able to kind of rinse and repeat and grow to a subscriber size that was a lot bigger than ours. You know, so like I said, my daughter was about to be born, and this is this part of the business where it sort of felt like, okay, either you know double down, or this is a time to get out. And so I think for me, I had to really evaluate like, what did I want the next few years to look like? How was it feeling at the time? And, you know, I think leading up to that business, I had just always been salivating at the idea of starting something. And honestly, and this is still true of me to some extent, that I think I like the starting of it more than the running of it. Right?
I had picked that up. Yeah.
I like the 0 to 1 instead of the 1 to 100. And just felt like at that point in the life cycle of the business, I had done it. I'd started something. We had gotten, you know, attention from all the places that I wanted to be. We were on Uncrate, we were on Huckberry, we were on Gear Patrol. We were like kind of all of these men's interest places. We had raised a little bit of money, so I had that experience. And then we had an opportunity to sell it, and I was like, this is a really neat and tidy little like arc to put a bow on this, and have the story to say that like, hey, I started something, and let this carry me to the next thing. And I think I liked the vision of being a serial entrepreneur more than I liked the vision of becoming like the cigar guy. Like even when we went to like Vegas for conferences, and would go to these cigar conferences, I would look around and I would be like, I don't know if I want this to be my life. I've heard it said since, and I think this is really true, that like if you're gonna start a business, you better be certain that you like your customers. And a lot of time there were a lot of people. I think the people who were trying to get into it, or especially people buying gifts, I really enjoyed that aspect of it. But anytime I would get somebody who was like a snobby, opinionated cigar smoker who would sort of like, you know, write to be like, oh, why'd you send me this thing? I hate this cigar. This is blah, blah, blah. Like
the kind that glare at you when you walk into the cigar bar.
Yeah.
And you clearly don't know what you're doing.
Yeah. People who like, that's their way of asserting how much they know about it, to sort of put down other people's tastes or other people's opinions about it. I
think that exists in a lot of industries, unfortunately.
Absolutely. I think any time that you get over a certain like tipping point of hobbiness, you become like almost a gatekeeper to other people who oftentimes just want to enjoy it. So all of these things happened. It was like, you know, it was nice to have a little like payday right before my daughter was born, you know.
Perfect timing, yeah. So
that was good. And in doing that, and this can be a kind of a transition into what I got into next, but while I was entertaining that option, I have no idea how to think about like winding the business down or how to sell a business. And so I reached out to the CEO of Tilt, and I was like, hey, James, hope all's well. This is what, like, curious if you have any advice on this. And he's just like, after that, he got into like doing a lot of startup investing, and just is super involved with a lot of younger founders in the Bay Area and Silicon Valley. And it was just really interesting timing, and he was like super enthusiastic, and I was, you know, telling him about what we were doing, and he was like, well, hey, it's funny that you called right now, because I'm working on like starting something which is like very much in this wheelhouse of a direct consumer brand. And his background had only been in software, and he'd been at Tilt and then been at Airbnb. And he was like, what if like I'll help you sort of think through and give some advice as you navigate this sale. In exchange, like how about just for a little bit, like I know your daughter's just about to be born and no long-term commitment, but and it was just like, I'll pay you. And I was like, this is a point where I'm taking everything that Good Cigar was doing and funneling it back into the business. And we weren't like going hungry or anything, but it was just,
You were staying lean to like
yes,
make sure it
staying
kept
lean,
growing.
and it was just appealing to be like, oh wow, a paycheck. Like,
Yeah.
I remember that felt nice.
Yeah.
And so I was like, sure, great. And so for me, that was this really great immediate transition into like, all right, let me just now like do it again. This is like a totally different wheelhouse. And so he was starting I guess you call it like an energy drink, but the goal was to kind of make like what 5 Hour Energy might look like if it was started in 2020 and not, 2005. So like, you kind of know
they've never changed their branding.
I know,
not even a little bit.
And the branding thing isn't even a problem. I think it looks exactly like it needs to look, to be like, just a grab and go in the gas station. But you also kind of know that it's not good for you when you're taking it. Like, it works. I don't know if it works for 5 hours, but
it does what it's supposed to.
Yeah, and so the idea that James had was when he was running Tilt, he was, like super caffeinated, like 5 cups of coffee a day. He was like 29 and running this like 80-person startup that had raised $50 million. And so just like really like, over his skis a lot, and was caffeinating himself so that he could do everything that needed to get done, and ended up having some sort of like crazy heart, like palpitation thing, and had to go see a doctor. And, just the doctor, he was explaining like how much caffeine he's having, and the doctor was like, hey, you gotta switch to 1 cup a day. And so James started looking at all of these other things like adaptogens and nootropics and other ways to kind of get that, like, harness what you need to,
like the brain power and like output that he felt like he was getting from it.
Yeah, exactly. So he's like, having some caffeine, having a normal amount of caffeine, like 100 milligrams, 150 milligrams maybe, and then adding on to that like L-theanine, which is an amino acid that helps extend your body's absorption of caffeine. So instead of getting like the kind of jitters from
things that kind of help with the bioavailability and other stuff.
Exactly. So he had done all of this research on, and was getting really into like, some of these kind of like functional mushrooms, like ashwagandha, or I don't know if ashwagandha is a mushroom, but reishi, cordyceps. So he had this little concoction that he had been taking and had been workshopping over the years. He's like, let's
just through like trial and error.
Yeah. So then he's like, this is the formula. This is what we want to make. So let's make a drink. And so, which is very different than making a, little cigar kit. But we're just
kind of a new challenge.
Yeah. So after the races of like, here's, I've got little Ziploc bags and powder, and I mean, I think, no, it wasn't even Ziploc bags and powder. He was buying off Amazon. Like, he had like this little stack of 12 bottles that he was taking every day alongside his coffee. And so,
wow.
So worked with him to take that all the way to like, a
product testing,
15 pack of bottles that you could buy off of Shopify. And so that was like the manufacturing of the drink, the packaging, the website, the, go to market, and all of the ins and outs. It was a lot of stuff that I had done with Good Cigar, and to do it with him was a way to do it with budget. So he had I think because of, his pedigree and skill set and his track record, even though the Tilt didn't IPO, but like, he learned a lot.
Even building a team like that.
This thing that was successful in a lot of ways just didn't make it to the end. And so we were starting from a point where he was able to raise $1 million, like, before we even had a product.
Wow.
And only gave away, I think, 10% of the company to do it. So like,
wow.
Commanded just like a very high valuation, which is a big thing to you then have to build a very big business to justify that and to get out and still get the kind of returns that an investor would want. So immediately after selling Good Cigar, was able to just like jump right in with James, and which was great because I feel like I was able to ride the high of like, hey, I did this and now I'm doing it again, and like that whole experience, like, put me in a spot where I could do this. I don't think that, this is exactly the kind of work that I want to be doing. And I don't think that James would have trusted me to build his, brand where he raised, I think I started Good Cigar with like about $12,000 for like the initial inventory and design out, when at
versus $1 million.
Magic Mind, we started with $1 million check from a very legit venture capital firm. So, like, in a sense, once I put aside the kind of dreams of like hanging out on the Good Cigar yacht, like this was just a really spectacular situation for me to be able to like tell this story and be able to have built a cool product and have a lot of cool experiences and get press and get attention from a lot of things that I wanted, and then immediately jump in and be able to do it and do that 0 to 1 again with James. And so learned a ton there, just very little overlap on energy drink from tobacco. But obviously the beauty of that is it's a lot easier to advertise. It's a lot easier to advertise. It's a much bigger market.
Much bigger market, much bigger budget, much easier to advertise.
Yep. And just, you've got like, there's just a higher willingness to try something. Like even somebody who's loyal to Red Bull or loyal to coffee, like the need for everyone is the same of like, oh, I'm feeling sluggish or I want to like get more done, is a easy thing to be like, hey, try this new thing, try this for 5 days, let us know what you think.
That's a great point. There's really not a ton of brand loyalty for energy drinks or like coffee or anything.
It's, from a business opportunity, it's a really smart thing to get into, because once it is a habit, like you're taking it a lot, right? So like if you're somebody whose go-to when you're studying in college or you're getting work done is Red Bull or Monster, like you don't realize the LTV of that, like how much money you've given to whatever your caffeine provider of choice is over the years.
Mine is anything I can get my hands on.
Yep. I've started drinking Bangs sometime, which I know is
I went through a Bang phase.
They work. They definitely work.
All too well.
All too well. So that was the business, and so there was a subscription component to it to be like, hey, we'll just deliver this to you, every 2 weeks or every month. And like all things, like kind of, you do the napkin math of, oh, this is like how much is going to make right away, and your margins are a lot slimmer than you thought, and you're essentially shipping water across. So shipping costs are super expensive. If people are drinking it every day, you're kind of like you're anchored a little bit to kind of like what you're spending on coffee, and so if you're having coffee plus something else, price point can be tricky for people. But so we're just off to the races with that, and the first part of it was a lot of like packaging design, website design, brand design, which I loved, and that's probably my favorite part of the direct consumer internet brand thing, is just to be
the brainstorming phase.
The brainstorming phase, and really the kind of just the visual aesthetic of it. I really enjoy that part, and the go to market and the marketing, and ended up in that role having to wear a lot of operational hats, and we have a situation where we need to make 20,000 more bottles and everything's there, but the cordyceps didn't arrive, and now where are you going to get that? And if you don't have one ingredient, you can't make the thing. Or we have enough bottles, but we don't have caps. So I forgot to order caps.
Oh man,
all that part of the business, that business, I was very bad at. And but like all things, you learn, the hats that you like to wear and the hats that you're not good at wearing. But end of the day, like you gotta make more product if it's going to work.
So are you still operating in that business right now?
No. So I did that for about 2 years. That I think we launched like right as COVID was like swarming and taking everybody, which was great. It was a great time to be in e-commerce.
Yeah.
Because suddenly you're like
everything's moving in that direction.
Used to going to your favorite coffee shop every day, and now suddenly you can't, and so you need some sort of like ritual at home and work, and so that was a lucky time to be starting a e-commerce business. But at the end of the day, that like and this is true of a lot of things, the dynamics of how you structure the partnership at the beginning of the business is so important. And I, coming off the heels of Good Cigar, one way to describe it is it was sort of like, it's like, maybe this is going to sound weird, but I heard this analogy once that it was kind of like you're like a rebound after a relationship.
Yeah.
Like Magic Mind was my rebound girl. So it was like, as great as that was going to be, it was never going to live up to like Good Cigar, which was like, that was the thing that I really wanted. That was my first love. And I was like, there were a lot of great things about Magic Mind, but just the way we structured the partnership, I was coming in and I was like, hey, this is your thing. I'm here to help make it happen. And by the time I left, I really felt like, I had done at least 50% of the lift to get it off the ground and to move, and just, was doing that for, around 5% of the company vesting over 4 years, and was just like, this was
Gotcha.
the economics of this. Like, this would have to exit for $100 million or more in order for this to be like a sweet payday for me.
Considering the amount of work done.
Yeah, and I've now done this twice, and if I were going to leave and start something that was 100% myself, it would only need to do $1 or $2 million of an exit for me to be in already a better position. So that's the dilemma for like any kind of like first employee. Like, if you're the first person in the door, you end up kind of doing founder level work without necessarily founder level upside, and there's a lot of those people end up. It's a great place to go and learn. I learned a ton launching that business, learned a ton working super closely with James. But just after 2 years in, was just sort of like, I feel like what the business even needed at the time, I think, was somebody who was like, who has experience. How do you get your product in Costco? How do you get your product on the shelf at Whole Foods? And what are the ins and outs of that? Like, who do you use to ship it? How do you structure your
logistics, supply chain,
such that it goes on the pallet and is the right size that's for maximal efficiency to be loaded on the truck? And how does it have to be labeled? And how do you, all sorts of things that I was learning and picking up as I go. But we were able to find like a GM who I don't think could have done the 0 to 1 as well, but was able to really pick up right there where we needed. And,
the 1 to 100, yeah.
Yeah, and so I'm still involved, like, very lightly as an advisor there, and have some equity in that business, and hope.
Oh, awesome.
Hope that it does well.
Yeah.
But just left before the full contract was over, with no hard feelings and no like difficulty in that split there, and gave a ton of time to be like, hey, I think I want to do the 0 to 1 again, and I think I want to do something that feels more like mine, and I'll help however I can in the transition to make that smooth for everybody. Because you're an owner too, so you don't want to do anything that's going to like torpedo the success of that business. So I guess left there probably about 1.5 years ago, and then since then have been working on, I guess what you call, this is like a grandiose term for it, but I would call it maybe like a venture studio, where he and I have come together and we're each putting in a little bit of capital to say, hey, let's try a handful of things all in e-commerce, direct consumer brands, and take a handful of swings, or we say plant a handful of seeds, and just sort of see which ones start to yield fruit the fastest and double down on the winners. So we've got like a beach umbrella concept. We've got a supplements product. We're working on a pet.
I think I remember you telling me about the supplement one when we last talked.
Yeah,
that was like one of the first ones that you
yes,
found.
and like longevity, the supplements resveratrol and NMN, which are particularly like exciting to people who are like who nerd out on
like biohackers
and living longer. There's a book that was written called Lifespan that just this guy kind of swore by those two things, and there was this immediate uptick there, and so we
making them more available to consumers.
Yeah, they're sort of like just niche. I think I'm not an expert in the supplement space at all, but it seems to be that those trends kind of hit heavy. There's like a season where everyone's like, everyone's got to have fish oil, and it's like suddenly like everyone's buying fish oil, or everyone's buying like ashwagandha or whatever. So NMN has been kind of like hot for a little while, and there's now stuff that they may be like taking off the shelves because somebody may be like patenting it. There's some complexity there. That ended up not being like a huge focus for us. I have probably 7,000 bottles of it in my closet that will probably expire before we can sell them. But it wasn't that expensive of a lift to do, and so that's what I'm doing now is.
Looking for those different e-commerce opportunities.
Yeah, sort of like prototyping some things and trying to figure out like how can you, it's going back to the Tilt days, like how can we validate that this is going to be a worthwhile place to spend our time in a good business, and how can we do that in as lean of a way as possible without forking down $100,000 on a site build out or an app build out or initial inventory. Like how can we kind of validate that this is going to be something that's going to be fun to do. And so the beach umbrella concept has emerged. We joke that like we're planting all these seeds, and then the beach umbrella pretty quickly grew like a magic beanstalk to the heavens, and we were like, okay, this is the better place to spend our time. And so
is that the two of you kind of founding all of these, or is it trying to identify founders that are in very early stages and kind of help them get off the ground?
Mostly us founding them. So we want to we want to build everything and own it outright. I probably have more of an appetite to do agency work just because if I could do the 0 to 1 and help people get off the ground and then let them run it, that would probably be, I'd love that.
Yeah.
And so we're still in the early days of figuring out exactly what we do want it to be, and I think there's a lot of different directions that can go. But the plan right now is that we would look at an emerging space or something that's doing particularly well and try to enter a market by quickly spinning up a brand and product and Shopify presence and Amazon presence, and then hopefully figure out throw some money in, measure acquisition cost, and if the economics work, then keep pumping it. And hopefully we could run,
because you've identified how to do those things very quickly and efficiently.
Right. And so and a lot of that, there's a ton of differences between a cigar product and a energy drink product, but we probably could use all of the same back office. Like those businesses could use the same person doing accounting and payroll and taxes, and probably could use the same warehouse for storing inventory and the same person running like pay-per-click campaigns or paid social campaigns. And so the idea is to have a handful of those under one roof.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, especially with the beach umbrella product, I think will be super, super lucrative. But it's a tough business because you're doing 95% of your sales in 4 months. And then you're storing that inventory for the remaining 8 months of the year. And
Gotcha.
if you do your planning wrong and you're sitting on too much inventory, then your storage costs are really high. And it's hard to sell, it's hard to move a lot of product for a beach umbrella in January.
Yeah.
Unless you're also in Australia, where your seasons are flipped. And so my buddy's actually flying, or my partner is flying to Australia today.
That's awesome.
Kind of establish there so that we don't deal with that problem. So
that's the big thing right now.
That's the big thing
just
right
like
now.
planting those different seeds, seeing like what takes off the most. That's exciting.
Yeah.
Lets you be like have a hand in a lot of different things and kind of just like continue growing that like 0 to 1 start off.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, it's very similar to the mindset of like an investor, right? You sort of have that portfolio theory, and you're going to make 10 investments, and only one of them needs to be hugely successful to make the model work. And so similarly for us, we might have a couple little small things that do like $2,000 to $3,000 a month in revenue, but if we find one that suddenly can do 20 or 30 or 40, then that becomes the cash cow, and you can sort of like
you just put everything into that.
Stabilize that, and then once you've sort of gotten that to a point where it's efficient, then continue to run it, and then use those funds to try to do it again.
Creating like a startup factory.
Exactly.
That's awesome.
That's the hope.
Well, I had a couple questions, and a lot of these got answered along the way, but I had a couple questions about just e-commerce and running a direct-to-consumer brand. We covered a lot of like the steps to getting started, the ideating. One thing, we covered a little bit about this, like studying the market and best marketing tactics. Just as like a way to touch back on that briefly, what are maybe like the top 3 takeaways through all your experiences and observations that you had as far as like the best tactics when you're launching and like trying to build a brand very quickly?
The first one I would say is to stay lean in the beginning, right? Like the more that you can validate the business and validate that there's demand for a product before you spend a ton of money on that product, the better. It can be tempting to spend a year perfecting, and my partner and I have a good balance here where it's more in my nature to want to like go slow and perfect and make sure that the first version of what we're launching is really, really great. But there's a Mark Benioff quote, the founder of Salesforce, who says if you look back on the first version of your product and you're proud of it, you waited too long to launch.
Ooh, yeah, that's powerful.
It's really hard to follow that advice as a founder because you're so particular about making sure that you don't throw the product out and it's just met with a bunch of like comments of like this is trash or customer support this broke right away. But I think every time that we have sort of erred on the side of action to push something out there to validate it before investing a ton, that has been a good approach. So I would say stay lean, try to validate that there's demand for something before you invest too much in it to make sure that people want it. So that's one. Maybe one sort of like position that I have that a lot of people don't feel the same way about. And I think that this is changing, as there was a sentiment for the longest time. This is going to almost go counter to what I just said, but I'm a big believer in like the power of branding, the power of polish in how you look. And I think that conveys a lot to the customer in terms of what they expect out of you. You know, like how you do anything is how you do everything. And so if your first impression with somebody is like, oh, this is this looks great, I think that's gonna just be super powerful with people in building trust and authority as an early brand. I think that people look to quality of branding, quality of aesthetic as a marker for quality in all things. And I think that
as much as we're told not to, people do judge books by their covers.
Yeah, absolutely. And there was a time in certain kinds of businesses, especially like B2B SaaS, for example, it's like it just needs to work. It doesn't need to look good. So that's not true. But what I do, which is like a direct consumer product, usually like unnecessary products that are vitamins, not painkillers. I think aesthetics matters a lot. And people will push back on that.
Things that are like a nice to have but not need to have, because you're going after a different kind of client that has some money to spend, some excess money to spend, and like very much does care about like the brand and the like being able to talk about it.
There's it's hard to compete on price with Amazon Basics or the Costco brand on anything, and so you sort of have to invest in that. And I think something that I say a lot is that like, and I'm not a designer, so I can say this and mean it, but like being thoughtful about your branding is free. Right? Like it's not free to use a designer. It's not free to pay Red Antler, which is like one of the best agencies in my line of work. None of that is free, but it is absolutely free to be thoughtful about like defining who your customer is and sort of understanding what's important to them and your brand voice and some of those attributes. And once you have all of that, then selecting like a typeface and colors and a mark is not that complicated. And if you've really, really identified know your brand system well and what you're trying to do and kind of the vision of what you're hoping to accomplish, it's very, very powerful stuff. And I think a lot of people don't spend enough time at the forefront thinking about it, because I think that brand is a sort of like a vanity exercise, and absolutely sometimes it can be.
It depends what you're into.
There's a tipping point where you've spent too much time on it, and definitely too much money on it. But I think thoughtfulness at the beginning about it is super, super important.
I like that.
And then that's two. Maybe there's a third one in there.
There could be two, because those were two very detailed ones.
Okay, cool.
That's fine. That covers a lot. I mean, that gives kind of, and I like that too, because it gives kind of both perspectives of the aisle there.
Yeah, and it's like do both. It's like make it look great, but also go fast and just launch it. Launch it already.
Do everything.
Yeah. Do it fast and do it perfect.
Yeah. Another thing I wanted to cover just briefly, because I want to be respectful of your time here, is just maybe top one or two takeaways of how to succeed working remotely.
Oh man. So I was telling you before this, my wife and I we left San Francisco, so we were both remote for about 2 years before COVID happened. And I think when COVID happened, everybody was lamenting for 6 months about how isolating and alienating it is to be on you get Zoom fatigue and all these things. And when everybody started to complain, we were both like, oh yeah, this does kind of suck. We almost didn't give ourselves permission to realize how hard it was.
No one would have accepted that at the time.
Yeah, because there's so many advantages to working remote. I think for me, it's about having a very clear list of I have a tendency to make a to-do list and put 10 things on it, and you have this idea at the beginning of the day that you're going to do all of those 10 things, and almost invariably you can't. And so I think having a system of productivity and accountability, with either if it's for yourself or just with accountability on who you're working with, I think is super important, just because.
And something that works for you personally.
Yeah. So I would say having a to-do list and being realistic about goals for the day, even if you're I have 8 things I'd like to do today, but if I don't get these 2 done, then the day was not good. Just sort of having some sort of very simple, achievable list of things that you need to knock out one day at a time, and then it's just about stacking good days on good days.
Love it. So I have a couple repeat questions that I ask in every interview. Kind of went over these with you off air, but the first one is if you could kind of travel back in time, and I'll use your beginning with Tilt as the starting point for this, but if you could travel back in time to the beginning of starting with Tilt and kind of getting your career in startups and commerce and e-commerce and everything started, and you could talk to a younger Will and tell him a couple things to do differently, what are a couple things you would tell him to do differently?
Man, I think I'd start with encouragement and just say, like, everything that you're doing, like, you're always learning, and if you're not learning, you should sort of shift, you should move. Like, when my first year at Tilt was customer support, which through one lens, like, doesn't have a lot of overlapping, like, skills to what I'm doing now, but it absolutely does. I mean, sort of like you're talking to customers all the time, and I think just keeping your head up high and saying that, like, knowing where you want to go, and saying, like, all along the way everything is valuable. You're constantly learning, or there are things that what you're doing now could be teaching you, and just making sure that you're always paying attention to that. That's one, and I think I built it up for such a long time in my mind that I would sort of like plan and scheme and what if. So I think I would just describe myself and just sort of be like, just do it, just launch, just like, this weekend, can you put something up to launch? And it's
Hop on Chat GPT and get it to help you get started.
Yeah, just be like, write, here's a concept, write 50, example marketing copies for that, and then spend $200 to sort of like make a cheap, crappy version of the first one of it, and take some pictures of it with your iPhone. It doesn't have to be perfect.
Oh, you could get some great product shots with an iPhone 14.
Oh, I know.
Oh,
yeah.
man.
It was easy then. I feel like when 2015, there were so many things that made it easy for me to do. It's only gotten easier.
Yeah.
So I would say that, and I would say it's to create content.
Yeah.
That's something that even now I struggle with, sort of like being in front of the camera. I'd rather sort of like, pay somebody who's more, just wired to want to be in front of the camera, and I'll be in the background making sure. But if you...
For saying that, you've been doing great with this.
Thank
you.
Yeah,
I hadn't noticed.
But I think that's super powerful. And now, even on advice I give people to start something, like, a lot of times, I think the old model was like, build a product and then build an audience. Now I think it's build an audience, and then once you have one, that's
you could go a lot of different directions.
And just building that skill set, because if you can't do it, you're gonna have to pay somebody else to do it.
Yeah. So the one other question I have for you is, the show is called Profession Session. I like to talk about all the different ways that things can be a profession. You've had your hands in a lot of different things and seen a lot of different ways that a profession and a career can play out. So my question to you is, what does it mean to you personally to be a professional?
The first word that popped into my head was reliable, right? So I think to be a professional, is about this shift from maybe caring about the outputs and not the inputs. I think, like, it is easy early in your career to think that your job is to show up and to, like, sit in the chair and to, like, check the box and talk to your boss and do the thing they're giving you, but to really understand what it is that you're there to do, and make sure that you're responsible enough to, like, bring it across the finish line, that you're the one who knows that it needs to happen, and that people can count on you to do that. I think that, to me, that is, like, to work with people who are professional. There's a guy that I worked with who was like a printer for marketing copy, and the tagline of his email was, if you think it's expensive to hire a professional, you should hire an amateur first, and then see how much more that costs.
Yeah.
Having
getting it done the wrong way
exactly.
a bunch of times.
Having pride in what you do, and just knowing that people can count on you to do it.
I love that.
Make it happen.
That's awesome. That's a great answer.
Thank you.
Well, Will, anything else you would want to share with the audience?
Yeah, I guess if you are heading to the beach this summer and you need some shade, you should head to beachshade.com. And
link will be in the description or the show notes.
Yeah, I'll drop links to a couple of Good Cigar Co. Still active. Support that business. Magic Mind's still crushing it. It's a fantastic product too. So yeah,
we'll make sure that you can find all of those in the show notes or the description. whether you're watching on video or listening on audio. Anything else?
That's all I got.
Thank you again so much for being on. This has been awesome, man.
Blast.
Great conversation.
Likewise.
Great catching up. Well, this has been Profession Session. I've been your host, Brody Vinson, and my guest has been Will McQuain of many different e-commerce brands and a lot of cool startup stories. Thank you again for tuning in, and we're going to go ahead and end it there. Thanks so much for tuning into Profession Session. I'm your host, Brody Vinson. And if you learned anything or enjoyed this video or podcast, don't forget to subscribe here on YouTube, where all of our other interviews can be found. We can also be found on all major podcast platforms, including Spotify and Apple Podcasts, as well as all the socials, LinkedIn, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, you name it. So find us anywhere, follow, like, comment, leave us a review on any podcast platforms that you enjoy. And if you know anyone that you think would be a great fit to be on the show, get in contact with me anywhere and just let me know, and they could be the next to tell their story here on Profession Session.